Thank you all. My name is Cliff Majersik. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Market Transformations. We're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., whose mission is advancing energy efficiency in the built environment, in buildings. And we work with governments and the private sector to try and do that. I'll be talking a little bit more about our work with governments and policy, but we also do a lot of work, which I'll talk a little bit at the end, about green leasing and helping companies prioritize energy efficiency in their buildings, align incentives, and organize their processes to achieve that. So what's the market impact of energy efficiency in buildings? Well, the United States, we spend more than $400 billion a year powering, heating, cooling, lighting our buildings. And a lot of that is wasted. Various estimates put it at something like 30% of the energy spend is cost effectively avoided using current technology. And we think that's a conservative estimate. There's a $278 billion opportunity to invest in improved energy efficiency of buildings. And there's a 3.3 million job year opportunity just from the multifamily sector of improving the energy efficiency of our buildings. So there's huge money that's going into energy and huge opportunity to invest more and get good return on that investment. Now, in terms of greenhouse gases and climate change, buildings are a huge issue. If you thought of American buildings, US buildings, as their own country, they would be the third largest country in the world in terms of carbon emissions after only China and the United States itself, and ahead of every other country, including countries like Russia and Japan. So there's a huge opportunity there if we want to address climate change by improving the energy efficiency of our buildings. Buildings consume about 40% of US carbon emissions, and it can go up to almost half if you include all of the embedded emissions in building the building and maintaining the building, driving there to maintain the building, that sort of thing. And it's even higher in cities. And here are 4 cities, big cities with good public transportation. And in those cases, you're seeing buildings typically operating north of 70% of the carbon from the city is coming from its buildings. And that includes all the carbon coming from the electricity that's consumed in those buildings. So it's huge, especially in cities. Here in Atlanta, and we do a lot of work with Atlanta, it's a little bit less big, but you can still see it's in the neighborhood of 60% of energy consumed and more than half of the carbon that comes out of the city of Atlanta. Not just the city, but all the privately owned buildings, all the privately driven cars. It's more than half of the emissions in Atlanta are attributable to your buildings. And this is 2013 data, but it's going to be pretty similar for the future years. So what do you do about that? Cities have long had building energy codes, building codes that govern how energy efficient new construction has to be. Existing buildings have long been sort of the blind spot. And of course, buildings that haven't been built yet don't use energy or create carbon. So if you really want to address greenhouse gas emissions, you have to address the existing buildings. The leading strategy that cities are engaging in, and jurisdictions more broadly, is looking at benchmarking and transparency laws to require that buildings make public the energy efficiency of their buildings. They're not actually putting labels on the sides of buildings, of course, but they are requiring that information be uploaded and provided on a public website for the world to consume, and through other channels as well. So I'll be talking more about that in a moment, but just as background, what all of the laws have in common is that they all rely on the Energy Star system of 1 to 100 rating system for buildings. And you can see that graph there shows the growth of properties that have been benchmarked. There are now more than 400,000 buildings in the United States that have been benchmarked in the Energy Star system, and more than 25,000 of them are Energy Star labeled. That means they're in the top 25%. And of course, the Energy Star rating is a 1 to 100 rating, where 100 is best, the top 1%, and 1 is the lowest 1%. 50 is average. There are also a huge number of corporations that use Energy Star as a regular part of their business, where, and you can see that some of the logos, some of the biggest players in the market, folks like Sunrise for assisted living, and CBRE, and JLL, and Target, all of these folks are routinely benchmarking most or all of their buildings. So it's, before there was ever anybody requiring their usage, it was a widely used voluntary standard, and it remains principally a voluntary system that people are doing because they want to save money on their energy bills, they want to reduce their carbon emissions, or advance their sustainability goals. And it's only became a requirement in some places because it was already so widely accepted by the private sector. Now, when you look at benchmarking and energy savings, what you see is that Energy Star looked at all of the buildings that had benchmarked every year over a 4-year span. So that's 3 years after the first year. And what they found is that when you looked at those 35,000 buildings, on average they were using 2.4% less energy each year. Now, of course, some used more energy, some used less, but on average it was a 7% reduction over that period. And those buildings were mostly doing it voluntarily. Now you look specifically at benchmarking and transparency laws. There was a study of 4 cities that had those laws, buildings that were subject to the laws and buildings that weren't. And it was pretty early snapshot, but just very early days before I think the laws had reached their full potential, you were seeing a 3% reduction in utilities expenditures by the buildings that were subject to the laws as compared to the other buildings, so controlling for other factors. And there was a survey of building operators in New York City, which has the longest standing benchmarking and transparency requirements. And there, 77% of the building operators responded to this survey that they had taken operational changes to improve the energy efficiency of their buildings in response to the benchmarking and transparency law in New York City. And 75% of them said that they had installed new equipment to save energy in their buildings. And there's a breakout as well of what exactly each of them said that they were doing. So very strong numbers of folks that are saying that this is actually driving actions on the ground in the buildings to save energy. Now, so who has these benchmarking and transparency laws? You can see the purple dots are jurisdictions that have laws that apply to just commercial buildings. The orange dots are jurisdictions that have laws that apply to commercial buildings and multifamily buildings. Then the green is just for government buildings, and the blue is single family. And that tends to be, you have to disclose your utility bill when you go to sell your home so that the buyer knows what the utility bill has been in the last year, say. Well, we're most interested in talking about the orange and purple, the requirements that apply to privately owned commercial and multifamily buildings. And right now there are 16 cities, 2 states, California and Washington State, and 1 county, Montgomery County outside of Washington, D.C., that require benchmarking and transparency of privately owned commercial buildings. And collectively, you're talking about more than 7 billion square feet of space that has to benchmark and disclose their ratings every year. And as you can see here, the big wedge is actually New York City's. Chicago's a big wedge too. California is not that big a wedge in this one because California's old law only required that you had to benchmark and share that information at the time that you sold your building, or you were leasing the whole building. But they've just added, changed their law, and now building owners are going to have to benchmark and disclose publicly every year. And multifamily buildings are added, whereas previously it was only commercial. That's why it showed purple in our map there. Now, both multifamily and commercial buildings will have to benchmark and share those results publicly annually. So this California wedge is going to go up by an order of 10 kind of thing as a consequence of those changes. So you're already talking, though, about a very substantial fraction of the market and in some of the most dynamic, valuable cities and states in the country that are subject to these requirements. And it's a growing, accelerating trend. So then the question is, well, what are we finding out from this data, and how is the market using the data? Well, the basic principle, of course, is like with a menu requirement where you have to share your calories, as now chain restaurants have to share calories on their menus, or a nutrition label on the side of a package, or a miles per gallon sticker on a car. And the basic principle is if a market is to function well, the information must be available to the buyer. The buyer should be able to make an informed decision. It's a consumer right to have good information about what you're buying. And you can imagine, what if we didn't have miles per gallon stickers? What if when you went to buy a car on the dealer lot, you couldn't tell the difference between a Hummer and a Prius? And in fact, if you couldn't tell the difference, why would you pay any more for that Prius? And if you're not going to pay any more for that Prius, why would the manufacturer spend any more to make their car more fuel efficient? Well, the same problem has long been the case with buildings. And so the whole edifice of ratings and Energy Star and benchmarking and transparency laws is aimed at allowing the market to do its job and to allow the ultimate customers, the investors and tenants, to be able to make informed decisions. This is especially important because typically tenants end up paying for most of the actual energy costs in the building. So they're sort of effectively buying a lemon if they're getting an inefficient building without knowing it. And it's resulting in increased investment in energy efficiency. And this is a study that we wrote looking at job creation with many case studies of 10 companies that had staffed up in response to the benchmarking and transparency laws and the other greener, greater building policies in New York City. And what we found is that some of them were doubling and tripling their staff, hiring more people because there was an increased investment in energy efficiency by the building owners when they had to make this information public. It also found that financing wasn't really too much of an obstacle, at least in this subset of companies. They had adequate access to financing, and the real problem there was inertia, that they hadn't traditionally invested in energy efficiency, even though there were very cost-effective opportunities. And I mentioned the 10 mini case studies. The bottom two are entrepreneurs who actually were working for companies, then staffing up their small companies in response to these benchmarking and transparency laws. The top photo is a photo of a venture capitalist out of Silicon Valley who said, we invest in clean tech companies, and what we tell our clean tech companies is go to the cities that have benchmarking and transparency laws. That's where there's actually going to be a market for your innovative products that are saving energy in buildings. And because of the nature of benchmarking and transparency laws, they're not technology specific. It's all about performance, results, how much energy is actually used in the building. So you can innovate however you're going to go ahead and save energy in that building. It's going to make the building look better in the benchmark, and it's going to create demand for your products. And what we are seeing is a virtuous cycle of competition. You can't manage what you don't measure. Traditionally, unfortunately, the market hadn't been measuring energy efficiency. But now, with these benchmarking and transparency laws, the market has the information about energy performance of buildings. That information is shared publicly. The tenants, the appraisers, everybody else can factor that into their decisions about where to rent, about how much the building is worth. And it makes the buildings that have the best ratings, it helps them. It gives them a leg up in terms of attracting and retaining the best tenants. It makes them more profitable, and the building owners, in turn, seek those profits and invest more money in energy efficiency of their buildings. And then it raises the bar, and the cycle repeats, a continuously improving virtuous cycle of competition to have the best, most energy efficient buildings. Now, the latest development is that the most widely used platform for tenants and investors, appraisers, and others getting information about commercial buildings is going to have the energy efficiency information right in it. This is an actual screenshot from CoStar, which is the platform that real estate brokers use. It's sort of the commercial equivalent of the multiple listing service. And they have committed to put the energy efficiency information, the 1 to 100 Energy Star score, as well as the actual carbon footprint information and energy consumption information from all of the cities and states and jurisdictions that have these benchmarking and transparency laws right into their system, which is what the brokers are using when they're helping their tenants, their potential tenants, choose what space they want. This is a screenshot from the Washington, D.C. data that they have. And you can see that's basically the outline of Washington, D.C., because each of those blue dots is one building that they have in their system. So very quickly, as these laws proliferate around the country, more and more every tenant will have information without even having to go to a government website to find out. They'll have it right there in the place where they always use to find their new office or new retail space, the information about the energy performance of these buildings that they can factor into their rental decisions. So what is the data telling us? What are we learning from having all this data? It's remarkable, when you think of a city or any jurisdiction, the most valuable asset, of course, is their people. The people is the most valuable thing that we have in our cities and in our places. But the second most valuable asset is their buildings. And it's remarkable how little these jurisdictions knew about their buildings before they had these benchmarking and transparency laws. They didn't know very good information about how big they were, how old they were, how many people worked in them, how much energy they consumed. And these laws are providing a wealth of information that has never been available. And we've only scratched the surface in terms of matching this new information from these benchmarking and transparency laws against other existing sources of information and drawing the connections, connecting the dots to really have some insight into how our built environment functions. So this is a bar chart here. The y-axis is the energy use intensity of the building. So the taller the bar, the more energy the building is using on a per square foot basis. And the orange bars represent multifamily buildings. The x-axis is the decile, the vintage of the buildings. And I apologize if it's too small for you to read, but the earliest buildings here are pre-1939. Pre-1930. The oldest buildings are post-1991. The takeaway from this two bar charts you see here is that in New York City, actually, multifamily buildings of all vintages have performed on average about the same in terms of energy use per square foot, with a little bit of a bump up in the 1970s and 80s when you had maybe some poor construction. Back then, there were some ideas in the 70s especially that nuclear power was going to be so cheap that we wouldn't even put in light switches because no one would bother turning off light switches. So you did have some pretty bad construction in that period. In office buildings, actually what you see is that the newer buildings are using more energy per square foot. And then on the right, you actually have the Energy Star scores, which account for additional factors like hours of operations and number of people in the building. And there, too, you see that the oldest buildings are performing with the highest Energy Star scores. And then everything post-1930 performs pretty similarly. So this is really contrary to what a lot of people expect. Most people think newer is better. And in many cases, the newest buildings are performing very well. But on average, the New York data is showing us that actually the oldest buildings had the highest Energy Star scores on the office building side. And in other cities where we've looked at the data, we've seen that there's very little correlation between age and performance. You have some great performing new buildings and some really badly performing new buildings, and similarly great performing old buildings and really badly performing old buildings. Another thing that we're finding is that there's just a huge range. You look at two buildings next to each other, two office buildings, they could be all glass. You could assume that they perform very similarly, but in fact, they may perform massively differently. In fact, in New York, if you looked at the 5th percentile, the buildings that use top 5% for energy use and the bottom 5% of energy use, you can see a 3x to as much as a 7x difference, where the low-performing buildings are using 7 times more energy per square foot than the high-performing buildings. So there's an incredible opportunity to save energy just by bringing our low-performing buildings up to the average. And in these bars, each little line represents one building. And you can see the darker areas are the areas where the buildings tend to be concentrated. But you have long tails of buildings that are using a lot more and a lot less energy. So switching now from the large building side to the single family side, IMT did a study, and a lot of what we do is we're trying to make it profitable to invest in energy efficiency through policies and through providing information and sharing best practices and just sort of connecting the dots between financial performance and energy performance. And a good example of that work was this study that we published. We commissioned the University of North Carolina to look at the actual mortgage performance, the default rates of homes that were Energy Star homes compared to other homes that were the same in every regard statistically, including things like the owner's FICO scores, the price of the home, the location of the home. So a very robust study done by the same folks at UNC that do studies for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and folks like that. And what we found is that, surprisingly, the Energy Star homes had a 32% lower default and delinquency rate than other homes, controlling for all those factors. That's an example of, we're leaving money on the table by ignoring energy as part of our mortgage underwriting process. We have poorer performing loans, higher default rates, people are losing their homes, and so there's a real opportunity for improvement. That's exactly the kind of problem that we try and address, both through research and through policy. And there's actually a law pending that the Senate has passed and that the House hasn't yet passed that would incorporate energy efficiency into the underwriting for all federal mortgages. So how is the market responding to this new data, this flood of data about the energy performance of commercial and multifamily buildings? Well, on the office side, which is where there's the most data, where the Energy Star system has been around the longest and is most widely used, there's strong data showing that green and energy efficient buildings command premium rents, premium sales prices, and premium occupancy rates. That is, they have lower vacancy rates. This is a graph where each color represents one study, and you can see the key there has a study. And I should say all of the slides that you see, all of the information that you see is on our website, imt.org, and buildingrating.org for the map and the bar chart, the pie chart of benchmarking laws. And this slideshow will also be available to all of you afterwards. So each bar represents one study, and these are the premiums that the studies found. Now, the studies looked at different buildings, different sets of buildings over different time periods in different places. So it's not surprising that they found different results. But what you see is directionally, they're all finding the same thing. They're all finding that these buildings are renting for more, they're selling for more, and they're having lower vacancy rates. And this particular slide is talking about Energy Star labeled buildings. Yeah, please. Is it a cause or a correlation? It's a correlation. So you know, it's very hard to know anything causal. And in fact, there are some interesting questions around causality. There could be some interesting differences. Now, it is controlled for age of the building, for Class A versus not Class A, for location. But it's very hard to control for some of the micro elements like the quality of the view. So I think there's reason to say, you know, this may, and we hear this from real estate stakeholders, you know, yeah, I know that our LEED buildings, our Energy Star buildings have lower vacancy rates, but I don't necessarily buy that these numbers are right, that the difference is this big. So I think that's an absolutely a valid criticism or question. But what we do generally see is that, and it's of course different from market to market, but the broad feedback we get from the real estate sector is, I'm not sure if I buy all the numbers, but I do know that we have lower vacancy rates in our green buildings. And then here is breaking out the studies. You can see the logo of the university where the study was done above each of the bars. And the green bars represent looking at Energy Star buildings. The blue bar represents looking at LEED buildings. And you can see the results of the premiums that they found. All of these premiums here are around rental, or, you know, the rental price per square foot. So that's just drilling down. And we have slides like this for sales price and other things as well. So you have also just a growing transparency, and we talked about this in the panel that I moderated this morning as well, but more and more companies are being transparent about their carbon, about how much carbon that they're using. And the most widely used platform for doing that is CDP. It used to be the Carbon Disclosure Project, but now it's just CDP. And you can see the growth of CDP, the number of companies that are reporting annually to them. So starting in 2003 and ramping up very quickly, there's now more than 5,600 companies around the world that report their carbon annually through CDP. And in the United States, it's 85% of the S&P 500, I think. So you're huge numbers of companies that are reporting. And so these companies, they want to get the lowest price real estate they can, but increasingly they also want to get the most energy efficient and carbon efficient real estate that they can because they want to make their numbers look better when they're reporting them publicly. And then a new entrant in this space, but very quickly growing, is GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And this is specific only for the real estate sector. So they don't even survey, you know, IHG hotels or Siemens. They don't participate in GRESB. This is just for REITs and other building owners that are leasing out space. And they now have $2.8 trillion of asset value of companies that are reporting to the GRESB survey. So it's an annual survey that they fill out where they talk about the energy efficiency and governance and social performance of their companies. Sorry, it's $2.8 trillion of companies that are reporting and $7.6 trillion of member investors. These are like institutional investors, pension funds and others that pay to support GRESB, and they tell all of their, the companies that want to receive their investments, we want you to fill out the GRESB survey because we want to use this as a factor in deciding where we want to invest our institutional money. So that's, again, driving more demand for this data, more demand for improved energy performance because the investors are saying, we think that green buildings are a better bet. There's less risk involved with them, and we want to invest our money in companies that have a track record of managing their portfolios for energy efficiency and green. So why, what are the problems? Why are we still seeing this huge opportunity for investment, huge, very good financial returns that you can get from energy efficiency in buildings that isn't, that's money on the ground that's waiting to be picked up. Why hasn't it been picked up? Well, there are a number of barriers, and they're long-standing barriers, but there's informational barriers. There's a lack of access to information about the energy efficiency of buildings. And that's exactly one of the barriers that these benchmarking and transparency laws are aiming to address. There's institutional barriers that institutionally many companies will have, say, a higher hurdle rate for investing in energy efficiency than they will for other investments. They don't really value energy that much. They're skeptical that energy efficiency is real. It's really going to save them money or deliver them higher revenue. There's transactional barriers, split incentives, and the most commonly pointed to split incentive, perhaps the most important split incentive, is the barrier of landlords and tenants both feeling like, why should I invest in energy efficiency? Because the other one is the one that's going to benefit from this building being more energy efficient. Because tenants pay most utility bills in most offices around the country and in retail and other building types. And yet the tenants say, well, yeah, maybe I'm paying the energy bills, but it's the building owner owns this building. Why should I invest in making this building better? It's the building owner's building. They should do that. And the result is inaction and inertia and no improvement in the efficiency of the building. There's organizational problems, misaligned incentives. You often have this where the difference between capital budgets and operating budgets. Yeah, if you invest more out of your capital budget, that's great. That'll save you money, but that's money in your operating budget, and you can't access that. The utility bill goes to somebody at corporate headquarters, and I here in Atlanta never even see that utility bill. Why should I care about doing something that's going to lower that bill? It doesn't reflect on me. All kinds of misalignments within organizations. But the biggest impediment is inertia itself. And the real estate sector is a very conservative sector. They say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if it's working okay, why should we do anything different? And so it's very difficult to get new practices in place. Unfortunately, the old practices are not very energy efficient. And so we have a huge opportunity for improvement by overcoming these barriers. Well, zeroing in on that split incentives barrier, the landlord-tenant problem, we actually run a program with the U.S. Department of Energy called Greenlease Leaders, which is a recognition program for landlords and tenants that are signing green leases. Those are win-win leases where both the landlord and tenant comes out ahead when the building is more energy efficient. And these are the logos of some of the big national companies that are Greenlease Leaders. Folks like Prudential and Kimco, which is the third largest retail owner in the country, GSA, which is the government's landlord, and actually locally here, a big national company, Jamestown. Those are some of the examples of Greenlease Leaders. Collectively, they own more than 1 billion square feet of leased space. So it's an opportunity for them to get recognized in front of their peers, and every May there's a deadline to submit the 2 signed leases that meet the lease criteria in order to receive this recognition. There's also a website that we maintain with the U.S. Department of Energy, which is the sort of one-stop shop for all things green leasing, and that's greenleaselibrary.com. So if you want model lease language, case studies of green leasing, best practices, that sort of thing, that's the place to go. And in fact, if you Google green leases, that's the site that comes up first. Do you have a question? Oh, thanks. So this is a map. As I said, you can get this information from the government websites, and the better governments now have these sort of user-friendly maps to see the energy efficiency of buildings in a space. So this is an example of the Philadelphia map. Each dot represents one building, and you can click on that building, and then you can see a profile of a building with information about the building and the energy score, how much energy is used in the building, the carbon of the building. Each city has a different map. They don't all look like that. This is a map from a different city. There on the right, lower right, is where I think we need to get to, but we aren't there yet, which is an augmented reality app that you have on your iPhone that's checking the data from the central database, and it gives you information. You point your phone, just like you're playing Pokemon Go. You point your camera at a building, and it colors that building with the energy efficiency of that building, and it gives you information about that building. So this is a notional graphic. It doesn't yet exist, but I think we're getting close to the point where we have that kind of level of information. In terms of other ways that we are engaging with building owners and tenants, this is an example of a report that we put out earlier this year jointly with the Chamber of Commerce from Cleveland. And we're working with landlords and tenants, helping them put in place win-win green leases, invest in energy efficiency in their buildings, do energy audits in their buildings. Landlords and tenants of all sizes, so everything from the Port Authority that owns and operates the airport down to the local coffee shop. And we have some great case studies and best practices, and all this is available on our website for free download. That's imt.org again. And looking at additional stakeholders, there are a lot of people that have a role in making sure that energy gets valued throughout the life cycle of the building. And this is looking at appraisers. We've partnered with the Appraisal Institute and the Appraisal Foundation. This is a guide that we've written jointly with them for appraisers on how to value energy efficiency in buildings. Because if the appraiser doesn't value it, it's very hard for the lender to value it. It's very hard to get that value when you go to finance the building. And this is a guide for building owners and developers on how to talk to the appraiser and how to think about how energy efficiency and green impacts property value, all the various ways in terms of looking at expenses, looking at income, looking at the risk and the cap rate of the building, look at the occupancy and the vacancy rates. And then we have a third guide that's not pictured here that's specifically targeted at lenders, how they should be thinking about green building and property value and talking to their appraisers. We also do continuing education for commercial brokers around the country, and I think soon we're going to be offering it here in Georgia, training them on how do you sell energy efficiency green buildings to your tenants, how do you think about green building and property value and green leasing. And lastly, an important stakeholder is utilities, because in order to benchmark a building, you need all of the energy data for that building. And if you have a multi-tenant building, that can be a difficult challenge if the bills are going directly to your tenants. And so we work to convince utilities and sometimes utility regulators that building owners need access to all of this data so that you can't manage what you don't measure. If you don't know the amount of energy that's being used in your building, it's very hard to make that better. And so the building owners need access to that whole building energy information. And this is a guide that we wrote for utilities on how to provide user-friendly access to that kind of data. Well, thank you all very much.